When my son was in a ski accident that led to a complex concussion, it was really challenging to find information for parents. I was dealing with medical doctors and they could tell me medically what needed to be done, but as far as the sort of information that would have helped me with his academics to scaffold and support him, that was not available. And now, when I look back, the few times when doctors did get information, it wasn't particularly helpful or thoughtful. That is what this episode is about. I have some information about the medical side, but really mostly I talk about the connections from the medical to the academics and what I've learned since then. I know that this is still an issue because people reach out to me with questions about what we did. It's really an area that it's hard to get information about, unfortunately, because if you're in it, it's kind of scary. I have since had someone point out that some of the things that I was dealing with are really similar to what parents who have kids who have long COVID are dealing with. I myself have long COVID, and I know that's true because of that. This is a homeschooling. Welcome here. My name is Blair Lee. Let's get started. I'll be talking about concussions now. I want to be really clear with everyone. I am not a neurologist. I am fairly knowledgeable, but if you suspect your child has a sustained brain injury or you have a neurologist that told you something different than what I told you, please let me know. But a pediatric neurologist is who you should go to for help and guidance. So I want to start by defining concussion. I always like to define my terms, as you might have noticed. A concussion is considered a type of traumatic brain injury, no matter how small. It results from a jolt or blow to the head or body that causes the brain to move rapidly within the skull, leading to chemical changes and sometimes damaging brain cells. Concussions are generally classified as mild TBIs, but even mild concussions can lead to serious and lasting effects. All that really says is most concussions are mild, not complex concussions. Particular mild concussions or TBIs that lead to lasting effects are can happen if the concussion isn't treated, isn't properly managed, or if it is a repeated injury. A complex concussion is a type of brain injury where symptoms are prolonged or unusually severe, often lasting longer than the typical recovery period for a mild concussion, 4 to 6 weeks. Unlike a standard concussion, which usually resolves within a few weeks, a complex concussion can involve complications like persistent headaches, memory problems, mood changes, balance issues, difficulty concentrating, and physical symptoms. By that, I mean issues with simple physical tasks, separate from mental tasks. The symptoms of concussions in children are shockingly wide-ranging. Cognitive symptoms, these are just standard, but there are others that I didn't include in the list. Persistent difficulty with memory, attention, and concentration. Slower processing. Can you tell? I'm struggling. I struggle with this. It was a tough period in my life and my son's, more importantly, in my son's. Slower processing speed is another cognitive symptom, and difficulty organizing and recalling information. Emotional and behavioral symptoms, irritability, anxiety, or mood swings. Literally, you have one child and then one injury later, you have a different child who you are dealing with. It's really something that definitely tests your ability to parent. increased sensitivity or to lighter noise, difficulty with impulse control and emotional regulation. Physical symptoms, headaches, dizziness, and fatigue. Sleep disturbances such as difficulty falling asleep or waking up frequently, and struggling with routine movements or exercises. The impact on brain function and development is also rather wide ranging. You see, children's brains are in a critical period of development, characterized by ongoing synaptic pruning, neurogenesis, and myelination. This is the process of insulating nerve fibers to speed up communication between neurons. A concussion disrupts these processes, and so how they're disrupted depends on the age of the child and what's going on in their brain at that time. Concussions can impair the brain's connectivity, particularly in regions involved in executive functions like planning, attention, and problem solving. This has to do with where people typically hit their heads and the location of the areas of the brain that control these functionalities. These disruptions may manifest as difficulties with academics, attention, and memory. Some of this depends on where your child hits their brain. Additionally, individuals without ADHD who sustain a complex concussion can develop ADHD-like symptoms. These symptoms may last for a short period or in some cases persist for the rest of their lives. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to reorganize itself. This is important for recovering after a concussion. One neurologist explained it to me like this. If you think about your brain as a road system with highways and side roads, when your brain is functioning normally, it's traveling on highways. But let's say you're on your way home and the freeway is closed. This would be, like if you had a concussion. So you have to take a side road home. This is where your brain reroutes information to still get there. You'll still get home. It just takes longer to get there. And for someone with a complex concussion, this altered neuroplasticity can actually lead to permanent rerouting. Now, that's good if the damage is permanent or if the damage lasts a long time. That's can make things interesting if someone fully recovers because they still may continue to reroute. And so they still may have slower processing, use kind of interesting thinking to get there. There can be long-term effects of complex concussions. The cognitive effects you observe when the brain is healing are substantial and significant. I didn't come to this understanding overnight, but it was because of dealing with this with my son that I came to understand there is no timeline for learning. When I say that to people, it is from experience. If your child isn't meeting the pacing that is set for them, the problem is the pacing, not the child. Never the child in this situation. Studies suggest that children who experience complex concussions may have an increased risk of developing anxiety and depression. These changes may persist for months, years, or the rest of their life after the initial injury. Children with a history of complex concussions are more susceptible to future concussions, especially if the brain hasn't healed fully, as happened with my son when they sustained the second concussion. This phenomenon is known as second impact syndrome, where a second concussion occurs before the brain is fully healed, leading to rapid and severe swelling. For my son, even though the second impact was much, much less severe, the effect from that concussion was actually more significant. So be thoughtful if you have a child who has had a couple of concussions, even if they're not complex concussions, a third concussion or repeated concussions can make everything amplified. Complex concussions are typically diagnosed based on a combination of symptom persistent neurocognitive assessments and neuroimaging. If someone sustains a complex concussion, rest and gradual return to activity are strongly encouraged. Prolonged periods of rest and inactivity are recommended. We were told that kids are more likely to recover than adults because when you tell parents that their child needs 6 months of extended rest in order to recover, parents make sure that happens. Whereas concussed adults are more likely to ignore a doctor's recommendation when they start to feel better. So the neurologist that we saw after the first concussion said to me, so this is happening in February of 2011. And he said, so how good is your child at school? And I'm like, well, he's ahead of everything. I mean, he's homeschooled. I didn't say anything at that time then, because this was toward the end of the diagnosis. And at this point, I was really kind of scared. He said, well, that's good because your child needs to take the rest of the year off school. Can you imagine? He's so lucky he was homeschooled. Can you imagine a parent with a child in school being told in the beginning of February that their child needs to take the rest of the school year off? They would likely have to start the following school year in the grade they were in at that time. So yeah, we took a lot of time off. The other thing, because of the anxiety, the ADHD-like symptoms and depression, counseling or therapy may be necessary for children who experience emotional or behavioral changes post-concussion. And if your child has a complex concussion, you and your child might benefit from some counseling. It's a tough time for parents. You're all there as the advocate and the support, but it is actually a really tough time in your life. I promise you. One of the most important factors in preventing a complex concussions or avoiding additional head injuries is to avoid additional head injuries. You should also use protective equipment in sports. Helmets are no joke. Proper training on safe techniques and allowing adequate recovery time before returning to activities is encouraged. If you are a sometimes we don't wear protective gear family, I recommend that the adults set a good example and kids always wear them. You just never know. Ongoing research focuses on identifying biomarkers for complex concussions that could help predict which children are at risk for prolonged recovery. Additionally, advances in neuroimaging and understanding neuroinflammation hold promise for better diagnostic and therapeutic options. My advice. I've got some advice on here. I got a lot of advice on this because it was something that I dealt with for 8 years of my child's life. If your child tells you they hit their head or they have a headache, err on the side of caution and assume that they have a concussion, a significant concussion. If they hit their head and vomit, which happens to be a key indicator for a child that they have sustained a significant concussion. Adults don't always vomit. Kids, not always, but almost always do if the concussion is significant. Get help immediately and insist that a neurologist evaluate your child as soon as possible. The first emergency room doctor who saw my child in 2011 told us that he banged his head pretty good, but seemed to be okay. This was on a Saturday. By Monday, I was sitting in the neurologist's office without an appointment in tears until a doctor would make time to see my son. By paying attention to my child's struggles and behavior, I knew something was wrong. It was really important that that happened because there's very definite treatment protocols that should be initiated right away for anyone who sustains a complex concussion. I already mentioned this. Well, and I should just tell you that my son he met the treatment protocols, but only because his concussion was so bad that physically he couldn't do anything. But if the concussion weren't as bad and your child got up and moved around or did something, you might, that would be outside of the treatment protocol, recommended treatment protocol. And I'll tell you what, it's really hard once your child starts to feel better to keep them as laying around, not doing anything. And that includes no video games, no educational TV, nothing that taxes their brain as it heals. I already mentioned point number 2 before, but it bears repeating. When you are dealing with any sort of issue that is impacting your child's ability to learn or participate in an activity, I understand that it isn't always convenient. And I understand that there are optional timelines for learning. But to push on instead of stopping and dealing with the issue, I believe with every bit of my soul and heart that it is a mistake. Be innovative, be organic, and be insanely alternative. That's what we had to do. And I know that a lot of you are dealing with this as well, because in many ways, I had a neurotypical child for 11 years. And for the last 14 years, my son's going to be 25 this month, I have had a child who isn't neurotypical. That pug that you see sitting in the background of a lot of my talks, that is our service animal. And she's quite an amazing service animal. She has actually spent 17 days, not all with my son, but some of them with him in the intensive care ward at hospitals. She was trained to be supportive for someone that had to rest and recover and to help with anxiety. She's amazing. If you ever want to talk to me about service animals, I trained her myself, which probably won't surprise you. And I'm happy to help you figure out how to train one. Your child is going through some stuff, big stuff, if they're dealing with any sort of cognitive issue that isn't the stereotypical normal. It was by watching my own son struggle that I came to understand how important it is to help children see themselves as a learner. I think that's important for all, but definitely for children who are not neurotypical, because they look at the rest of the world and they see they're different, and kids don't always understand how beautiful different is. I did not have anyone to talk to about what I was going through. This was in 2011. The internet wasn't what it is now. So eventually I started C. I was so lonely and desperate for people to talk about. I want to thank you so much for being there for me when I needed all of you. If you're thinking I wasn't there for you, I didn't know you then, Blair. Well, people just like you were there for me. I don't know what I would have done without everyone who provided support. I'm tearing up. You can't see it because I'm off screen, but I struggled so much during the tough times to talk about it. That was such a mistake, though, because I deprived myself of the beautiful community and support that I would have had. I see it happen all the time in C. And if I'd have been able to give a voice to what I was going through, I would have had more people there for me. That's one reason I try to be really present for people whenever they reach out to me, and it's one of the guiding lights of C. Uh, the Monday after his first concussion would not be the last time that I cried to get help. I'm not much of a crier, but that wasn't the only strategy, and that wasn't the only strategy that I used, but I became a relentless advocate for getting the help my child needed. I learned a lot of things like nurses are your friends, and and wonderful advocates themselves for getting you in to see doctors. I also learned that doctors that don't make time to see emergency patients, to see patients in an emergency situation, weren't going to be good doctors for talking to someone about traumatic brain injuries. They just weren't as helpful as the wait would have made it worth seeing, as the wait made it worth it. Well, I hope you found that informative, and I hope if you needed this information that it was helpful. If you have a question, please just leave it in the comments and I will respond. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification button. Bye, everyone.